So I just want to thank everybody who worked on organizing this event, and happy to see a lot of familiar faces. I'm also excited that there are 3 anthropologists on the panel, which is not usual situation, but I'm glad that the field is very much engaged in the communities we study. So what I thought I would do is just talk a little bit about the quick background of Iraq Veterans Against the War. Don't want to assume that everyone knows that history, which is now going on 12 years. A little bit about my own story and how I got to the place of becoming a conscientious objector. So I did not deploy to Iraq or Afghanistan. I refused to do that, and saw the humanity of the people of those countries and told the military as much. And then just talk a little bit about what our responsibility is as veterans. And I think from the beginning, Iraq Veterans Against the War has been interested in the idea of reparations. I think operationalizing that and overcoming some very complex barriers has been a challenge for sure. So Iraq Vets Against the War was born in the summer of 2004 with the first wave of troops coming home from the invasion of Iraq, which was March of 2003. I think initially we started basically as a speakers bureau, just sort of providing speakers for events that other people had organized, and just kind of a loose collection, a network of veterans around the country. I should say that that summer of 2004 there was a Veterans for Peace conference in Boston, so that's kind of the first gathering of Iraq veterans, and very much encouraged by the veterans from previous wars, particularly Vietnam veterans and members of Vietnam Veterans Against the War and Veterans for Peace. So that link of organizing across generations is hugely important, and I think one of mentorship and support and guidance and all of that. So I want to highlight that. It's a 12-year history, so I won't go into too much detail, but I think, at a certain point, particularly around 2006, we were less satisfied with just showing up to other people's events and began to shift towards organizing ourselves as veterans and organizing active duty military personnel in addition. So we sort of moved into a chapter organizing model, and at the height, there were 65 chapters around the country, including 3 at active duty military bases. A chapter basically was comprised of 3 vets in the same place that were equally pissed off, and decided to have a meeting and join the organization. So, and I'm proud to say that the New York City chapter is chapter number 2. So we were pissed off pretty early on, and met at a bar, and that's how all great revolutions begin. 2008, I think, is a high point for the history of IVAW. It's a moment where we came together to tell our stories in a really kind of forceful way. I think we were frustrated with the narrative at the time about the Iraq War, and that things like the Abu Ghraib scandal were isolated incidents from the perspective of the military, and we wanted to challenge that and encourage both veterans and active duty military personnel to come forward and tell the truth about that and connect the dots between what was happening in various cities around Iraq as well as Afghanistan. So we pulled together the Winter Soldier Iraq and Afghanistan event, which was in March of 2008. March tends to be kind of the anniversary for us of a very solemn anniversary of the invasion, but also a moment to sort of reflect and highlight the issue of the war to people in the United States who often are just kind of oblivious to what was happening overseas. So Winter Soldier was really important for us. I think we went into the event with about 800 members. By the end of that year, we had doubled in size. Democracy Now! Covered all 4 days of the event. The kind of concept of Winter Soldier comes from Vietnam Veterans Against the War, which goes all the way back to Thomas Paine and the American Revolution, and that sort of moment when the Revolutionary War and the military at the time was not doing so well, and the difference between a winter soldier versus a sunshine patriot, somebody who would only fight when things were going well and the weather was nice, versus sticking through and seeing the job through. Vietnam Vets Against the War did a similar event in 1971 called the Winter Soldier Investigation, so there's a direct link in that history. And I think that in addition to the event itself, kind of getting a lot of international coverage. I feel like people in the UK and Japan know more about Winter Soldier than here in the United States. So there was a lot of mainstream international press, but in terms of US mainstream media, total blackout. It was also an election year, so we were up against that. But I think they just didn't want to touch these stories with a 10-foot pole. It was just too raw, too real. We intentionally did it right outside of D.C. in Silver Spring, Maryland, at the National Labor College. So there, no excuse for the military for the media not to show up. I think we got a piece in the Washington Post in the kind of metro section was about the extent of the coverage there. However, tons of independent media, including Democracy Now!, as I mentioned, were there, and thankful to them for doing that, for that coverage. It's not like we didn't do our homework. There were over 200 outlets that registered for the event and were there. So there was a lot of people, a lot of cameras, a lot of interviews happening, and a lot of messaging and press conferences going out. We also edited those testimonies into a book that's just published by Haymarket Press. We followed up that event with Winter Soldier on the Hill, which was taking the same stories to Congress. So it's part of the congressional record now. And there was also a book tour. The book was translated into Japanese, and there was a book tour all around Japan. So strong anti-war movement there, and obviously anti-nuclear war movement there. The next, I guess, high point for us was Operation Recovery in 2010. We launched that at Fort Hood. At the time, there was a rash of suicides. There was a shooting at Fort Hood, and it's the kind of high-tempo deployment military base, and just also, every problem that you can think of in terms of what the military faced, it was concentrated at Fort Hood. So that's why we chose it. It's also the largest military base in the country. We did, a lot of on-the-ground organizing with active duty personnel, family members, people in the community, and did a whole kind of interview project and published a report, which is several hundred pages long, of all of those stories, and have, done the work to share those stories with decision makers and policy makers to ensure that they're aware of these things and that there's something being done about it as well. And then lastly, we've been, connecting with Center for Constitutional Rights, War Resisters League, and, working on trying to bridge these gaps between what's happening here in the States and the amazing connections that Ali Issa and others have been making internationally and with Iraqi civil society. We had a Right to Heal project that we were working on. I think there's a lot of complicated issues there in terms of why should we work with these veterans who were here and part of the death and destruction. And so I think that some of those relationships still need to be teased out. And so work that Ross has been doing and the Islah project I think is super important to come at it from a grassroots perspective. I will say though that one question I have for Carly, and we can talk about it later, is whether or not the grassroots approach can take it to scale to be effective and to act, to really make an impact without having additional resources, financing, support. However, I know that given the history of U.S. reparations, that often also means that we leave a military base there for ever or for an extended period of time. So I definitely understand the challenges of coming at it from a state and sort of international community type of approach. So quickly, my own story, I tend to get long-winded, so I'll keep it short. I think for me, the turning point was 2004. That was when the Abu Ghraib scandal broke in the media. That was also when we kind of encircled and went house to house in Fallujah, and all of that was happening in the media very prominently as I was wrestling already with my military service. I think my questions started all the way back during like the day of 9/11, asking myself, what the hell am I doing in the military, and who am I expected to go kill? I don't know why it didn't dawn on me sooner, because at that point I had already been in the military for almost 10 years. I credit studying anthropology and changing my worldview and kind of seeing things from a different perspective. I also think that I was just older, and when I signed up for the military, I was 16 and went off to basic when I was 17. So I don't know that I was thinking about just war theory at that tender age. But I certainly was, 10 years later. And I was really uncomfortable with the way that politicians were talking about the invasion of Afghanistan once it became clear that that's where we were going. What little I knew about Afghanistan, I knew that there were a lot of everyday people and very poor people living in a country that we were about to bomb and send in special forces and the whole weight of the military boot, so to speak. So I wrestled with that, and like I said, 2004 was a turning point for me. I think once the Abu Ghraib scandal broke, I saw those pictures. I really didn't identify with the soldiers in those photos. I identified with the brown-skinned men who were being, completely disrespected and treated in a way that I thought was just, this is not what I signed up for. And ultimately got to the place after a lot of soul searching to, I can't do this anymore. I'm not thinking like a soldier, and I know I'm going to refuse orders if I'm put in a position to do these types of things. Even as a medic, my last jobs were in the medical field, but I just didn't want to be complicit with it. Even patching people up was going to be part of the occupation. In terms of responsibilities, I think that definitely being part of some efforts towards reparations is extremely important. I think we owe that to the people in the countries that we've occupied, of which there is a long laundry list of countries that we've done that to. So it's not just this present global war on terror moment. Often we talk about what the veteran is owed, when they come back. It's a shame that the veterans are treated the way that they are, and it is. But the veterans are not the only victims of war. I think we need to really think about that. We need to look at the history of warfare, and the vast majority of people who get killed and wounded are civilians, right, that are non-combatants. So we just need to really think about that. Supporting Iraqi civil society and I would say Afghan civil society as well for these current conflicts is hugely important. And Iraq Veterans Against War has been involved in some of that, so we have sent members back to be part of delegations to participate in labor conferences in Erbil in Iraq. We've done that twice. Jacob George, who's a member who unfortunately we lost to suicide, but had traveled back to Afghanistan with Brock McIntosh and was making connections with the Afghan peace volunteers and other groups on the ground there in Afghanistan. So I think first developing those relationships and then figuring out the best way to support based on the leadership that they're giving us. That what they're telling us to do, not coming in and providing some sort of charity. I think it's important for veterans to tell their stories and to tell the truth about what war is really like. People get all kinds of ideas from Hollywood and the way that the politicians talk about war and the honorable thing that it is to go off and kill people. Even if a veteran hasn't come to an anti-war position, if you just listen to war stories, they are inherently anti-war because they're awful and ugly, and there may be some few and far between bright spots, but for the most part, most vets, I think, will, if they're being honest, will tell you that war is an ugly thing, and there's a lot of examples of that. I think we do need to take care of our vets. I think we do owe veterans, the benefits that they've earned and deserve, and I think people are often surprised at the disconnect between this mystique that we have about veterans and military service and then the reality of veterans and their everyday lives. There is a huge gap there. Part of telling the truth is also just educating youth about war, and getting in there early, because certainly the recruiters are getting in there early, as early as elementary school, having National Guard units visit children and sponsoring different types of programs, junior ROTC, all of these things. So, preserving our youth. I have a son now, and I'm very concerned about the possibility that he would serve in the military, at least without knowing what the reality is. And lastly, or 2 points, I think shifting the defense budget, which is now, over 54% or 54% of our discretionary budget, the federal budget every year, is dedicated to war, and that doesn't include veterans benefits. So that's just maintaining our military and our nuclear arsenal. And it also does not include contingency operations overseas. So there's trillions of dollars that are being spent. That's our money. That's our tax dollars. And I think it needs to be reprioritized. Budgets are a reflection of our moral values. And, I think that most people don't support the idea of the military taking such a huge piece of the pie. And lastly, I think, in addition to reparations projects, we need some sort of truth commission process or something to get the truth out there, and some sort of way to collectively take responsibility. So not just putting it on certain communities, but everyone hearing and taking action to shift the way that things have been working. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.